Hey everybody, and welcome to part 5 of Core Fundamentals of Web Development. In this video, we're going to get an introduction to working with DOM elements, adding event listeners to those DOM elements. We're going to talk about how to declare variables with ES6, so const versus let versus var. And we're going to do all this so that we can accept comma-separated input from a user. All right, so what we want to do here, let's look at our finished product, is let users type in stuff, and then as they press comma, go ahead and add that category to the list of categories that they're adding for this link. So that's what we want to get to, and we're going to start by coming into our JavaScript here. And what we first want to do is get a reference to this category's input, and then add an event listener that gets triggered every time they enter a key, every time they press a key down event. Let's start by declaring a variable. So let's start with var. We're going to get into let and const shortly. But let's say link category is going to be document.query selector. And then inside of query selector, we're going to pass in the ID of link category. Now link category is, let's see here, is this input with the ID of link category. So that's what that is. And let's first just start off by console logging link category. So let's save this. Let's pop over to our console and we should see output. And notice that this link category, the thing that got output, matches exactly with what's in our DOM. So document.query selector allows us to give it a query, so you can do basically your CSS selectors, and it returns that DOM element, or if you do query selector all, it'll return a list of the elements that match that pattern if you have multiple with one class or something like that. But for now, we're just getting one. And notice here that inside the parameters, you have to pass in the string that has the full selector. So it's got the ID, hashtag, and then it's got link category. Now there's other ways to do this. You could do a get element by ID, and then that way you just have to pass in link category. Or if you had a class, you could say get element by class name, and then just pass in the class name, container, or whatever it is. But for me, it's just easier to always use query selector and just pass in the CSS query that I'm looking for. So I'll use query selector. You guys are free to use your get element by class name or get element by ID, whatever makes the most sense to you. So we've got this DOM element. Now we want to add an event listener to it. So link category dot add event listener. And I love Visual Studio Code because I'm getting all this IntelliSense to show me what functions are available. And it actually also shows me the different events that I can listen for. But what I want to listen for is the KeydownEvent. And then my second parameter is going to be a function. And the function is going to accept a parameter of event. An event is actually what we're going to use to look to see what the user is doing, what the user did, what key did they press to trigger this event. So let's see a console log here of event. If we come in here and type keydown, notice there's an event. Notice it's got a key here, so the key is S, the code is key S, and then there's one other thing that we can look for. The key code is 83. Now each of these, let's see here, each of these characters on the keyboard has a number associated with it. And if you're interested to find out what the number is, keycode.info, actually created by Wes Boss, who I told you guys I'll mention him probably more than once in this series. As we press keys here, it's going to tell us what the key code is. So I'm looking for comma, which turns out to be 188. Let's come back to our event handler, event listener, and let's say if event.keycode equals 188, let's print out a log statement that says user pressed comma. So let's save this, and let's get rid of the log of the event itself. Let's get rid of that. Save it again. So as I'm typing, I'm not typing commas. We shouldn't see anything. As soon as I hit comma, we should see our log statement saying the user pressed comma. So we're actually pretty well on our way. Now what we want to do is take the input, the value of that of link category, and push it to an array at that point. So console log. Let's take a look at link category, and it's going to be dot value. So every time I press a comma in here, it should give me the value of what's before it. All right. So that looks good. Now we need to create an array that we can add that value to. So it's going to be a running tally of the categories that we've added for our link. Before we do that, let's go ahead and dive into the difference between var, const, and let. So var has been the way that we define variables for many years in JavaScript, and there's some quirks about it that I don't fully understand at all times. I've certainly had issues with. And so with ES6 coming out, they came up with 2 new ways to declare variables, const and let, and they had their own kind of specific purpose or place to be used, but they are basically replacing as a pair what we previously used as var. So I want to give you guys, like I said, a couple of resources for each of these videos, or most of them at least. And I've got one here. It happens to be Wes Boss again, but he just happens to have great content that I follow. And he's got a article talking about let versus const. So let's first talk about let versus const. ES6 variable declarators, I guess is what you would call it. And what we're looking at is one of the basic ideas is that const is going to be an element that you can't reassign. So if I say const nums equals array, and then try to say nums equals a new array, save that, I should get an error over here in the console that says assignment to constant variable. So also, same thing if I said this is a string of nums, so 1, 2, 3, and then said nums equals 2, 3, 4, save that, and I'll get another error, not area. So basically, const is going to be a number that can't be reassigned. Now, if you're familiar with JavaScript object notation, so if we do an object in here and we have a property of, actually let's change this a little bit. So let's call this person, and we've got a name property, and we'll say James is the name. So if we've got a const object and we do person.name and reassign a property within there to Jess, let's say, who's my wife, that's okay. What we can't do is actually do a reassignment to person. So if I then went person equals a new or a different object, I can't do that. But I can reassign, I can change values of that object itself. I just can't reassign to a new object. Now let is going to be kind of everything else. When you're looking at const versus let, it's const for everything that's not going to be reassigned, let for everything else. And then the difference really becomes let versus var. So let's take a look at an example here. Let's do a for loop. So for let I equals 0. Notice I'm using let instead of const because I need to reassign I as it increments. Say while I is less than 10, I plus plus. And inside of here, let's do var count 1 equals I. Let count 2 equals I. And then we'll just console log count 1 and count 2. So this is pretty straightforward. We'll get they're the same value as we iterate through, so 0, 0, 1, 1 up to 9, 9. Now here's where the big difference comes into play. If I try to log these out here, so not var, but count 1, console log count 2. If I try to log these out here, maybe take a second and pause the video to see what you guys think would happen. Now I can tell you in my experience with Java or C# or one of those kind of languages, these would not work. First of all, you wouldn't be able to in an IDE, it would give you an error and not even let you try to build this. But things in JavaScript are a little bit different. So actually, let's run this and let's just see what happens. We'll see that uncaught reference error is count 2 is not defined. So notice that line 11, the console log of count 1, that actually worked, but count 2 did not. So the difference between var and let is that var, the scope for var, is going to be whatever the parent function is. So in this case, the parent function is just this script file. So it's basically the global object. It sits on the global object. So count 1 can be used anywhere within its containing function. So for loop is not considered a function. And since it's not considered a function, you can reference count 1 anywhere in the script. Now count 2 is scoped more kind of what I think of as being normal, or more of what I would expect, where if you declare a let variable inside of a for loop, that variable can only be referenced inside of that for loop. So that's the big difference behind var and let. To me, let is an obvious improvement. It's much more readable. It makes a lot more sense to me. It's kind of how I think. Some people maybe are more used to var, so they're kind of used to that, and then maybe don't want changes. I don't know, but this is what the future is. Const and let is the future for defining variables in JavaScript as of ES6, and you'll see less and less var going forward, and at some point probably even no var. All right, so let me strip out these examples, and I kind of talked about that so that we could update our variable declaration. So this is going to be a const because we're not going to redeclare it. And then we're going to have a let for link category. So this is something that we're going to need to reassign at some point. So there's our link categories array. And let's just say as we go through and back to our comma separated input, if we get a key code of 188, let's take the link categories array and push on. So push the value of link category. So link category dot value. And then let's console log link categories so that we can see what it is. All right, so let's come back here. We'll type in, we'll do a comma. We'll notice there's our array. We'll type in, we'll get another comma, and then it's adding on the entire output. So what we really want to do is when we hit a comma to go out and clear out the input inside of basically the value of this input. So we'll do link category dot value equals empty string. That'll basically just clear it out. So let's type in something, press comma, and then we get the comma actually showing up here. And we type this and comma, and then it looks like it's working, but the comma's still showing up, which looks a little bit weird. And the reason that's happening is we want to actually not have that comma show up. We just want to have the comma be a trigger, basically. So inside of if our key code is 188, if it's a comma, we're going to do event.prevent default. So this is going to prevent what happens by default. By default, when you press a comma in an input, it displays the comma. But now we're going to stop it from doing that. And we're going to use prevent default in a couple of different scenarios going forward. So just know that if you want to kind of prevent whatever the default action is in this event handler when it gets triggered, you can manually do that with event prevent default. So let's say I'm typing in, let's say node, comma, there it is, node, and it's empty here, which is great. So node, Angular, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, whatever we want to do. And we've got our comma separated input looking pretty good here. So we've got the testing there done. I'm going to go ahead and strip out some of these console logs. We don't necessarily need them. Oop, there we go. And we're going to do one last thing. We're going to say after we add it to the array and then clear out our value, I want to display the updated categories on our screen. So I'm going to call a function called display link categories, and then I'm going to define that down here. All right, so there's our function. And for right now, I just want a console log displaying link categories. Now, the reason I did this, and let's just make sure this is working, make sure it's getting called. There we go. Now, the reason I did this is we're going to have to add some extra functionality to actually display them that we'll cover in a future video. We'll cover this in a couple of videos ahead. So for right now, I just want to stub out this function, make sure it's getting called, and I can check that with the console log. So this is a kind of an important video. We talked about some ES6 features with const and let and how they relate to each other, how they relate to var, and how going forward we're really going to be using const and let. We talked about how to use query selector, so document query selector all, get class or get element by class name, get element by ID. And then we also talked about a keydown event and passing a callback function with the event variable using prevent default to obviously prevent whatever the default action is, and then taking the event to check some property on that event to see if it's the right event that we're looking for. So we covered some great stuff. We're going to be using a lot of these techniques in the videos coming forward. So I hope maybe if you guys need to take a break and rewatch some of this if it kind of takes a little while to sink in. But in the meantime, we're going to go ahead and jump to the next video. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.